He walked 22 miles to work every day, disappearing into the darkness. No one knew why until a police officer followed him that night. What he saw changed everything. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The small house at the edge of the forgotten Alabama town had once been white, or at least something close to it, but time and weather had peeled most of the paint away. Now it stood tired and sallow, its boards warped from humidity, its porch slanted as if exhausted from trying to hold itself up all these years. Inside, 2 rooms tried their best to function as a home, though in truth they resembled a shelter on the brink of surrender. The air carried the faint smell of old wood, dampness, and cheap cleaning supplies, an odor that spoke not of carelessness, but of a life lived in constant survival mode. In the back room, where the only window stuck half open because the frame had swollen, Marcus's mother spent most of her days lying on a sunken mattress covered with faded sheets. The illness had drained her slowly, leaving her with trembling hands and a fragile chest that rose and fell with uneven breaths. She had once been a strong woman, a force of nature who worked double shifts in a diner to raise her only son, but now even sitting upright required effort. On the nightstand beside her were orange pill bottles arranged like sad little soldiers, some half empty, some full, all expensive. Their labels formed a timeline of the last few years of her life. Symptoms, diagnoses, changes in treatment, all held together by Marcus's desperate attempts to keep her afloat. The kitchen hardly deserved that name. Its counters were uneven. Its fridge rattled so loudly it sounded like an engine on the verge of explosion, and the cabinets housed more air than food. A half loaf of discount bread wrapped in a flimsy plastic bag, instant noodles, a jar of peanut butter nearly scraped clean, and a few wrinkled apples were all Marcus could afford that week. Every time he opened the fridge, the cold breath that escaped felt like a reminder. This is all you have, and soon even this might disappear. The bills piled on the table beside the sink, corners curled, some envelopes unopened out of fear of what waited inside. Disconnection notices, overdue statements, medical charges. Each one was a threat hanging over him, whispering promises of eviction, of darkness, of a life unraveling beyond repair. Marcus tried not to let his mother see how worried he was, but in truth, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him with unbearable force. Every morning he woke up already tired, already defeated, but he forced himself forward because she depended on him. If he failed, she would have no one. When she called him with a weak voice from her room, he always answered with warmth he didn't feel, always smiled even when he had nothing left inside to smile with. He felt guilty for every day they spent like this, guilty that he couldn't give her the comfort she deserved after decades of sacrifice, guilty that their lives had become a constant countdown. His search for work had been a losing battle for months. He filled out applications on the old laptop that overheated every 15 minutes, then walked from business to business in whatever worn clothes he had, hoping someone would see past his fatigue and past the poverty that clung to him like a second skin. He received rejections so routinely that he could predict the tone before the first word even left a manager's mouth. Sometimes they softened their voices, trying to sound regretful. Sometimes they didn't bother. He was either underqualified or overqualified, too far away, too uncertain, too poor, or simply not worth the risk. And every rejection dug into him a little deeper, carving out another piece of hope. Still, he kept trying. He had no choice. He couldn't watch his mother's health deteriorate without fighting. He couldn't let the house slip away from them, even though the bank seemed almost eager to take it. But hope, as fragile as it was, came from the most unexpected place on a humid Thursday afternoon. He stumbled upon a job posting pinned to a bulletin board outside a local grocery store. The flyer advertised a position at a warehouse 2 towns over, general labor, steady pay, full-time hours. The requirements were simple: strength, reliability, and willingness to work long shifts. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of dread and possibility. It was farther than he had ever commuted, but it was a chance. And chances didn't come often. The problem, of course, was getting there. His old sedan coughed, rattled, and stalled on good days. On bad days, it barely made it out of the driveway. But he had no alternative. He checked his mother's breathing before he left, made sure she had water and her pills, then whispered that he would bring home something good. The drive to the warehouse was a test of nerves. Every mile felt like a negotiation between him and the vehicle, as if he were coaxing an old dog to walk just a bit farther. The engine sputtered like it resented his request, but it pushed on, mile after mile, until the warehouse eventually rose in the distance like a massive gray promise. The interview was as brief as it was unexpected. The manager was a tired-looking man in his 50s who scanned Marcus over with the speed of someone used to disappointment. He asked a few basic questions. Could Marcus lift heavy boxes? Could he work weekends? Could he start soon? And listened to the answers with a mixture of skepticism and resignation. But Marcus's sincerity, his determination, and perhaps the desperation in his eyes seemed to break through. The manager nodded, more to himself than to Marcus, and said the words Marcus hadn't heard in months. "You got the job." For a moment, Marcus felt light, almost weightless. A job meant income. Income meant medication, electricity, food, and hope. It meant a future. He thanked the manager repeatedly, shaking his hand perhaps a little too firmly, but he couldn't help it. The warehouse job wasn't glamorous, but it was everything he needed. He drove home with windows rolled down, letting the warm breeze carry his relief. He imagined telling his mother the news. Imagined the way her tired eyes would brighten just a little. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that things might change. But reality doesn't care about hope. It doesn't wait for the right moment to strike. The universe, in Marcus's life, had a habit of unraveling victories before he could fully grasp them. The sedan that had carried him to the interview gave its final sigh just a few feet from their driveway. Smoke poured from beneath the hood as the engine died with a long, wheezing groan. Marcus jumped out, lifted the hood, and was hit with a wave of heat and the acrid smell of burning oil. The sight was almost too cruel to bear. He poked around the parts with no real understanding of engines, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead as panic clawed at his ribs. He dialed a mechanic and described the symptoms. The man didn't even need to see the car to deliver the blow. Repairs would cost more than the vehicle was worth. Marcus's heart sank. He hung up and leaned against the car, staring at their dim house, the flickering porch light, the silhouettes of the trees swaying in the evening breeze. This was supposed to be the turning point. Instead, it felt like the universe had yanked it away at the last second. The warehouse was miles away, too far to reach by bus, and he had just been given the job he desperately needed. To lose it before the first day was unbearable. Inside, his mother slept with the soft, uneven breathing of someone who no longer had strength even for restless nights. He stood at her doorway, watching her chest rise and fall in the dim lamplight. She looked much smaller than he remembered, fragile, almost breakable. The thought of telling her he couldn't take the job was enough to make his throat tighten. He knew what losing the house would do to her. He knew she wouldn't survive the stress of becoming homeless, of losing the last safe place she had in the world. He couldn't let that happen. Later that night, when the house was silent and the hours crept toward midnight, Marcus sat at the edge of his bed with the glow of his phone illuminating the darkness. He opened the map application and typed the warehouse address. 22 miles. 7 hours on foot. The route wound through rural roads, past long stretches of nothing but trees and fields, past neighborhoods he had never visited, and intersections with no streetlights. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was nearly impossible. And yet, as the minutes passed and he stared at that number, 22 miles, something inside him settled. It wasn't courage, not exactly. It was necessity. He changed into the most comfortable clothes he had, pulled on the worn sneakers that were beginning to fray at the seams, and filled a small backpack with a bottle of water and a stale sandwich left over from earlier. The phone went on the charger, and he set the alarm for midnight. He lay down beside it, staring at the ceiling, feeling his heartbeat in his throat. Tomorrow would define everything. Tomorrow would determine whether he and his mother could keep their home, their dignity, their lives together. When the alarm finally broke the silence, Marcus rose with a heaviness that felt almost physical. But beneath it pulsed something stronger, a refusal to surrender. He checked on his mother one more time, kissed her forehead gently, and whispered that he would be back soon. Then he stepped out into the night, pulling the door shut behind him. With that single decision, the long, dark road ahead ceased to be just a road. It became the line between hope and despair, between survival and ruin, and he knew without a shadow of doubt that he would walk every mile of it. The night felt heavier than usual when Marcus stepped off the creaking porch and onto the quiet road leading away from his home. The humid air clung to his skin, thick with the scent of wet grass and dust, and the darkness around him seemed alive, stretching into an endless tunnel of uncertainty. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the faint glow of distant streetlights, and listened to the stillness that lay over the town. It was the stillness of a world asleep, oblivious to the battle he had just begun. Behind him, the small house blended into the dark as though trying to hide its own fragility, and the thought of his mother sleeping inside tightened something in his chest. Her breathing had been shallow when he checked on her, and the memory of it pushed him forward. There was no turning back. He began to walk, each step placing him farther from the life he knew and closer to a world of unknown dangers. At first, his pace was steady, driven by a mix of adrenaline and determination. The sneakers on his feet were worn down from years of use, but the cushioning, thin as it was, felt adequate for now. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, the feel of the cool night breeze brushing past his face, and the faint whisper of leaves overhead. The houses along the first stretch of the road were dark, save for the occasional porch light left on intentionally or forgotten in haste. The silhouettes of mailboxes and garbage cans flickered past him like silent sentinels of the sleeping neighborhood. His thoughts jumped between fear and resolve. The enormity of the distance ahead loomed before him, but the thought of losing the job overshadowed every worry. If he didn't arrive on time, everything he had hoped for, everything he had fought for, would slip through his fingers. The warehouse manager had offered him something rare, an opportunity, a chance that people like Marcus rarely received. He couldn't waste it, not after months of searching, not after everything his mother had sacrificed to keep their lives afloat. As he reached the edge of the neighborhood, the safety of familiar streets disappeared behind him. The road widened and stretched into a long, unlit highway flanked by tall trees and empty fields. The darkness here was different, deeper, more impenetrable. The kind of darkness that made a person feel small and exposed. Marcus tightened the straps of his backpack, took a slow breath, and stepped onto the asphalt. The night sounds grew louder in the emptiness. The droning hum of insects, the rustling of animals moving through the brush, the distant croaks of frogs hidden somewhere in the blackness. Every sound made his heart flicker, but he forced himself to focus on the white line at the edge of the road. It became his guide, something solid to hold on to. The miles crept by slowly, almost painfully. The initial surge of energy began to fade, leaving behind the first aches in his calves and the dull throbbing in his feet. His breath grew heavier, but he pressed on, refusing to slow. Time felt strange, elastic, stretching and compressing in unpredictable ways. When he looked at his phone for the first time since leaving home, he was disheartened to see that only an hour had passed. An entire hour, and he had chipped away just a small portion of the night. The warehouse felt impossibly far away. He tried to distract himself by imagining what the job would be like. He pictured the warehouse interior, the stacks of boxes, the workers moving in purposeful rhythm. He imagined showing up early, being dependable, earning the trust of his supervisors. He imagined bringing home a steady paycheck and placing groceries on the kitchen table. Real groceries, not cans of soup or instant noodles. He imagined handing his mother her medications without calculating the number of pills left in each bottle. These thoughts strengthened him, but the reality of the walk still chipped at his resolve. A movement in the shadows ahead caught his eye. A stray dog, or maybe a fox, its shape indistinct in the darkness. It darted across the road, startling him, and he stumbled back, his breath catching in his chest. His heart pounded for a full minute afterward. He wasn't used to being alone at night in places like this. The town had its dangers, but the roads beyond it belonged to something else. Nature, unpredictability, the unknown. When the animal disappeared into the undergrowth, Marcus forced himself forward again, trying to shake off the fear crawling up his spine. The road sloped slightly upward, and the added effort made his legs tremble. Sweat dripped down his forehead even in the coolness of the night. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, blinking to clear his vision. Every few minutes he glanced behind him, convinced he heard footsteps or wheels on the pavement. But each time, he saw nothing but the same empty stretch of highway swallowed by the dark. He tried to remind himself that fear was natural, that he wasn't imagining danger but preparing for it. Still, the sense of being watched lingered. By the second hour, his feet were beginning to burn, the worn soles of his sneakers doing little to cushion the impact of each step. He slowed slightly, pulling his shoulders back, trying to adjust his posture to ease the pain. The backpack felt heavier now, its straps digging into his shoulders as though punishing him for daring to carry anything at all. He thought of stopping, just for a few seconds, to stretch or sit, but fear held him back. He didn't know how much time he could afford to lose. The margin between arriving early and arriving too late was razor thin. When a soft breeze swept across the fields, it carried with it the distant scent of rain. The air felt moist, heavy, as though the sky were preparing to open at any moment. Marcus shivered at the thought. Rain would make everything harder. Visibility, footing, even his own morale. He tried to quicken his pace, hoping to outrun whatever weather approached, but the ache in his legs protested with every attempt. He pressed his hand against the small of his back, trying to soothe the tightness spreading up his spine. A sharp pulse of pain shot down his leg, forcing him to stop for the first time. He sat on a patch of grass beside the road, shaking from fatigue. His lungs felt tight, and he bent forward to catch his breath. His shoes were damp from the dew, and when he slipped them off, he saw the blisters forming on the edges of his heels. The skin was raw, tender, already splitting in places. He grimaced and pulled the shoes back on, knowing he had no other choice. The pause only made the road ahead feel longer, as though the darkness had stretched during the moments he'd stopped moving. He forced himself up again, leaning slightly to one side to spare the foot that hurt more. Time moved strangely during the next stretch of the walk. The night became quieter, as though even the insects had grown tired. The only sound was the steady rhythm of his footsteps and his breathing, now heavier, more ragged. His mind drifted in and out of focus. Sometimes he imagined himself at the warehouse already, punching the clock with a sense of accomplishment. Sometimes he imagined collapsing on the road, unable to rise. Sometimes he imagined his mother waking up and calling his name, wondering where he was. He didn't know how long he'd been walking when he realized he was sweating despite the chill. His shirt clung to his back, and each step felt like dragging sandbags behind him. The fear of failure began whispering in his mind. 7 hours. That was what the map had said. 7 hours of walking. And he wasn't even halfway yet. He wondered if anyone had ever done something so foolish, so desperate. What would the warehouse manager think if he knew the truth? Would he admire Marcus's determination, or would he think him unstable, irresponsible? Another hour passed, though it felt like 3. The darkness was lighter now. The faintest hint of blue clung to the horizon. Dawn was approaching, and with it came the unsettling realization that he was racing against the sun. If daylight broke fully before he reached the industrial district, he might not make it in time. He imagined the buses that would begin running inside the town. Imagined the workers arriving from their comfortable homes, arriving rested, ready, clean. He imagined himself appearing among them drenched in sweat, dirt clinging to his legs, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. But he could live with embarrassment. What he couldn't live with was losing the job. His legs shook now with every step. The pain in his feet had intensified from burning to stabbing, a sharp jolt each time his heels hit the ground. His breathing was uneven, coming in rapid huffs, and his vision blurred each time he blinked. Still, he forced his body onward, focusing on the patch of road ahead. He counted his steps. 100. 200. He lost count and started again. Counting gave him something to hold on to when his thoughts threatened to break apart. The faint glow of headlights in the distance made him stiffen. He stepped farther off the road, his heart pounding. A truck roared past him, its headlights spilling out in a cone that illuminated him for a brief moment. He must have looked pitiful, a lone figure carrying a small backpack, sweaty and bent over with fatigue, trudging through the night like someone lost between worlds. The truck's engine grew quieter as it continued down the road, and the silence that replaced it felt heavier than before. Another mile dragged by, then another. The muscles in his thighs trembled uncontrollably now, and he had to pause again, this time leaning against a guardrail to keep himself upright. He swallowed hard, trying to ignore the dryness in his throat. His water bottle was nearly empty, and he took only the smallest sip before forcing himself to save the rest. As he stood there, catching his breath, the faint rustle of something moving through the field beside him sent a jolt of fear through his body. He couldn't see it, but the sound alone reminded him how vulnerable he was out here. He pushed off the guardrail and continued forward, willing his legs to carry him just a little farther. The faint blue of morning grew stronger, bleeding into the sky like a slow promise of relief, but relief was still far away. Buildings began to appear in the distance, small ones at first, then a few larger structures. Signs, storefronts. A faint hum of early morning activity reached him, and hope trickled back into his heart. He wiped his forehead, though the sweat had already dried into a salty crust. By the time he reached the outskirts of the industrial district, he was barely walking in a straight line. His feet dragged, his vision dimmed, and his shirt clung to him with a cold dampness. He kept moving by instinct more than strength, his mind fixated on a single truth. He had to make it. He had to. The warehouse building appeared like a monument rising out of the ground, its metal siding gleaming faintly in the morning light. The sight broke something inside him, not in pain, but in relief so profound it nearly brought him to tears. He had made it. He staggered toward the entrance, trying to compose himself. He wiped his face, straightened his shirt as best he could, and pushed the door open. The warehouse was still quiet inside, workers trickling in. No one knew what he had just endured. No one knew the battle he had fought on the dark road or the miles he had conquered through sheer will. They saw only a tired man reporting for work, early and silent and ready. He clocked in without a word, pushing away the desire to collapse. There would be time for rest later. For now, he had a shift to complete, and after that, another 22 miles to walk home. The thought made his stomach twist, but he didn't let it stop him. He hadn't walked through the night to give up now. By the time the workday ended and the sun hung hot overhead, Marcus felt as though he were held together by nothing more than determination and pain. His muscles screamed with every movement, his throat burned from thirst, and his feet felt as though they had been flayed. But he stepped out onto the road again, ready for the long journey home. The miles ahead were daunting, almost unimaginable, but he reminded himself that he had done it once and somehow survived. He would do it again, and again, for as long as it took, for as long as his mother needed him. The sun dipped beneath the horizon as he walked the last stretch toward home. Darkness returned, wrapping around him like a familiar, unwelcome companion. By the time he reached the porch, his legs were numb, his vision blurry. He opened the door quietly and stepped inside, feeling the weight of exhaustion crush him as he closed it behind him. He checked on his mother one last time before collapsing into bed fully clothed. Her breathing was steady, peaceful. That sight alone made every ache worth it. As he drifted into an exhausted sleep, a thought lingered in his mind. This was only the beginning. Tomorrow would demand the same of him, and he would answer it. The following days unfolded with a relentless sameness that seemed to blur time itself into one unbroken line of exhaustion. When Marcus awoke the next morning, he could barely lift his legs from the bed. The ache from the previous night's journey lingered deep in his bones, radiating through every muscle as though he had been beaten rather than merely overworked. His feet throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, the tender skin beneath his heels stinging each time he shifted even slightly. But the alarm on his phone, shrill and unforgiving, reminded him that rest was not a luxury he could afford. Another shift awaited him, and before that, another 7-hour walk through the darkness. He rose slowly, careful not to wake his mother, who lay curled beneath a thin blanket in the next room. Her silhouette was barely visible in the dim morning light. Even from where he stood, Marcus could see the fragility of her frame, the rise and fall of her chest uneven and shallow. The thought of her condition, of the medications she needed, anchored him. Every step he took, every mile he walked, was for her. He couldn't let her care slip, not when she depended entirely on him. By evening, when the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the walls of their home, Marcus prepared for the journey once more. His body protested at the very thought of walking, but the quiet desperation beneath his ribs pushed him forward. He changed into his now slightly damp clothes, pulled on the same worn sneakers, tightened the straps of his backpack, and stepped out into the night again. The air was dry and heavy, pressing against him like an invisible weight. This time he felt no initial burst of adrenaline, only fatigue layered on top of fatigue. Yet he walked. The road ahead stretched endlessly into darkness, a ribbon of asphalt lit only by the hopeful glow of the moon and the occasional flicker of passing headlights. The noises of the night seemed sharper now, and every rustle of grass or whisper of wind set his nerves on edge. The pounding of his sore feet against the pavement became a steady beat, each thud a reminder of how fragile the human body could be when pushed past its limits. But he kept moving. His breath came out in slow, controlled exhales, fogging the night air in pale wisps. He walked through the ache, through the tightness in his chest, through the burning fatigue clawing at every fiber of his being. Hours passed, measured not by clocks, but by the increasing agony in his legs and the growing desperation he felt each time he checked the time on his phone. The night offered no mercy. The moon drifted behind heavy clouds, leaving him in near total darkness. There were moments when he could barely see the lines on the road and walked by instinct alone, trusting his memory of the path more than his vision. His mind dipped in and out of clarity. Sometimes he felt almost delirious, caught between waking and dreaming as he trudged forward. By the time he reached the warehouse again, his body was trembling. His hands shook as he touched the cold metal door handle, and he steadied himself against the wall before stepping inside. No one noticed the state he was in. No one saw the blisters hidden beneath his socks, the redness in his eyes, the stiffness in his shoulders. He moved through the shift like a machine, pushing himself beyond reason. He lifted boxes with aching arms, bent to pick up crates though his back screamed, and completed every assigned task with quiet precision. Whenever someone glanced his way, his expression remained neutral, almost unreadable. The world around him continued as though nothing extraordinary were happening, because no one knew. The return journey home was somehow even worse. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, unresponsive and numb, moving only because he commanded them with whatever scraps of willpower he had left. The road seemed longer, as though it had stretched overnight, taunting him with its unending expanse. The sounds of nocturnal creatures no longer startled him. They were muted by the overwhelming exhaustion that made him feel half-conscious. He didn't remember how he reached the house that night. The last thing he recalled was seeing the faint glow of the porch light flicker in the distance. After that, he found himself inside, lowering his body onto the mattress fully dressed, his limbs too heavy to lift. This routine became his life. Day after day, night after night. He would wake after only a few hours of sleep, his body stiff and sore, his mind clouded by fatigue. Yet he rose every time, checked on his mother, and prepared himself for another 22 miles. The road became both his enemy and his companion, a place of suffering and determination intertwined so tightly that he could no longer separate them. As the days turned into weeks, the toll became visible in ways he couldn't hide. His face thinned, dark circles carved deeply beneath his eyes. His gait changed, becoming slower, heavier. Some days he limped from the moment he left the house. His feet blistered so severely that his socks would stick to them, and he dreaded the moment he would have to peel the fabric away. But he never stopped. Each night he pushed past the point of exhaustion, surrendering his body to the journey while his mind clung desperately to the hope that one day this struggle would bear fruit. Hunger became another quiet enemy. Marcus often skipped meals so that he could save money for medication. His mother needed another refill, and he knew they were running low. So he rationed everything. A single meal became a luxury. There were days he left for the warehouse on an empty stomach, walking 7 hours with nothing but a sip of water and willpower to sustain him. Sometimes he felt faint halfway through the journey, his vision darkening at the edges, but he pressed forward every time. Back home, his mother watched him with increasing worry. Though he tried to hide it, she noticed the slump of his shoulders, the tremble in his hands when he brought her tea, the way he leaned against the wall when he thought she wasn't looking. He avoided her concerned questions, always brushing them aside with a tired smile and gentle reassurances. She suspected he was overworking himself, but she didn't know the extent of his suffering. Marcus kept his burden close, believing that the truth would only cause her stress she couldn't afford. One night, as he prepared to leave for another long walk, thunder rumbled in the distance. The forecast had mentioned a chance of rain, but Marcus hoped it would hold off. As he stepped outside, the first drop landed on his cheek, cold and heavy. Within minutes, the drizzle turned into a steady downpour. The sound of raindrops beating against the pavement echoed through the empty streets. His clothes clung to his skin, soaked through almost instantly. Each step became treacherous. The road slickened beneath him, and the darkness thickened with fog and mist. Visibility dropped sharply. The beam from his phone's flashlight barely cut through the gloom. His shoes squished with every step, water pooling inside them and softening the skin of his feet in painful ways. He stumbled often, slipping on wet patches of asphalt or uneven ground. At one point, a car sped by too close, sending a spray of cold water over him, leaving him shivering and gasping. But the worst moment came when a sharp pain shot through his ankle as he misstepped on a muddy patch. He lurched forward, catching himself just before falling. His ankle throbbed viciously, and fear gripped him. If he was injured, truly injured, he wouldn't be able to walk the remaining miles. He wouldn't make it to work. And without work, everything would fall apart. He stood on the side of the road, blanketed by rain that showed no mercy, breathing hard and gripping his ankle, fighting against the overwhelming urge to collapse. The warehouse felt impossibly far away. He whispered a quiet plea, to whom or what he didn't know, and then forced himself forward again. His limp slowed him down, but he refused to stop. Every step was agony, but he walked through it, drenched and trembling. The rain turned the world into a blur of shadows and sound, but he pressed on, relying on sheer willpower to guide him. It was during that stormy night that a set of headlights appeared behind him. The light cut through the fog in a steady, controlled sweep, not like a speeding car, but like a patrol vehicle. For a brief moment, the beam illuminated him clearly. Soaked clothes, limp, grim expression etched with pain. The cruiser slowed as it approached, and Marcus felt a jolt of panic. He didn't want to draw attention. He didn't want to be questioned or delayed. But the cruiser continued past him without stopping, though the officer inside seemed to glance back through the mirror. Marcus didn't know it yet, but that brief encounter planted the first seed of curiosity in the officer's mind. The image of a lone man walking through a violent storm at 3 a.m. lingered far longer than the officer expected. It was unusual, strange, and somehow unsettling. Marcus was too focused on staying upright to notice anything beyond the immediate struggle. He kept walking until the rain eased, until the sky began to lighten, and until the warehouse finally came into view, a distant outline blurred by exhaustion. Inside, he worked silently, as always, hiding the limp as best he could, ignoring the stinging pain with every lift and every step. No one asked him why he was soaked to the bone. No one inquired about the redness on his ankle or the way he clutched boxes to steady himself. The warehouse was a place of routine and indifference. People came, worked, and left. Their lives didn't intersect unless absolutely necessary. Marcus slipped into that rhythm without complaint, disappearing into the background like a shadow. Days turned into weeks, and the routine became a quiet torment. Marcus no longer felt the difference between exhaustion and consciousness. The two blended into a single, dull state. He walked through the nights as though in a trance, each journey blurring with the last. He could no longer remember what it felt like to rest without pain. Yet he kept walking. He kept showing up. He kept working. And all the while, unnoticed by him, the patrol car began passing the same stretch of road more frequently. The same officer, now familiar with the time and the silhouette, found himself watching, questioning, wondering. A mystery was taking shape, a story written in the shape of a man walking alone through the night, unseen and unacknowledged. But Marcus was not thinking about mysteries or patrol cars. He was thinking only of survival, of responsibility, of the mother waiting for him at home. Each night he stepped out into the darkness, unaware that his lonely march was no longer entirely unseen, unaware that the world around him had begun to take notice, unaware that his quiet, invisible heroism was on the verge of being discovered. The routine that had taken hold of Marcus's life, those endless nights of walking and the silent days of labor, unfolded with such monotonous cruelty that he no longer noticed the changing seasons or the subtle shifts in the world around him. What he noticed instead were his feet, always burning, his legs always trembling, and the way darkness thickened around him at different points along the road, as though testing how far he could push himself before breaking. Yet he continued to move, night after night, following the same narrow strip of asphalt until the shape of each bend, each ditch, and each worn-down road sign became etched into him. But he was no longer the only one who knew the rhythm of his route. Officer Jake Harris had been patrolling the county's night shift for years, long enough that his internal clock could predict which neighborhoods would cause trouble and which roads would stay still and empty until dawn. But over the past several weeks, something new had entered his routine. A lone figure trudging through the darkness at hours when even the most restless souls stayed indoors. At first, Jake dismissed it as nothing more than a wanderer or someone returning from a late shift. But the man appeared again the next night and the next, always on the same stretch of road, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always walking with the same steady determination that looked too purposeful to be random. The first night Jake noticed him fully, he had slowed the cruiser without even consciously deciding to. Rain had been pouring in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible, but the headlights had cut through just enough to reveal the silhouette. Drenched, limping slightly, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Jake had instinctively reached for the radio, prepared to call it in as suspicious activity, but something about the man's posture, bent under exhaustion, not menace, made him hesitate. The cruiser had rolled past, and the sight had lingered. The next night, Jake had driven by with deliberate attention, scanning the shoulder where the man had walked. And there he was again, this time moving more slowly, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. This wasn't loitering, nor was it wandering. This was a pattern, one that seemed carved out of necessity rather than choice. Something in Jake's instincts shifted. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that people walked at night for two reasons. They were running from something, or they were running towards something. And whichever reason applied here, it didn't fit neatly into any category he recognized. Marcus remained oblivious to the attention. His mind had narrowed to a kind of tunnel vision, one foot forward, then the next. The knowledge that he had walked this path dozens of times didn't make it easier. Instead, it weighed on him like a memory his body couldn't release. His muscles burned in ways he could no longer describe, and his sleep, if the few hours he collapsed into each day could be called that, did nothing to restore him. The fatigue lived inside him now, a constant presence he could neither ignore nor overcome. On one particular night, when fog lay thick across the fields like a shroud, he noticed the faint glow of headlights behind him. It wasn't unusual. Trucks and cars passed him regularly. But this light didn't behave like the others. It didn't rush past in a burst of speed or blink sharply into his periphery. Instead, it followed him, growing brighter at an unnervingly steady pace. Marcus tightened his grip on the backpack strap, his pulse quickening. The last thing he needed was trouble. He had no time for delays, no energy for confrontations. He moved to the far edge of the shoulder, but the cruiser slowed anyway, its tires crunching softly over gravel. Jake watched the man from behind the windshield, his brow furrowed. Up close, the sight was even more perplexing. The man's clothes were worn, his shoes near ruined, and his eyes, when the beams briefly illuminated his face, held an exhaustion so deep that Jake felt it like a physical presence. There was no drunken sway, no frantic glancing around, none of the signs he associated with troublemakers. Just a tired man moving forward with the weight of the world on his back. Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something was wrong here, deeply wrong, and he couldn't pretend otherwise any longer. Yet, he didn't stop him. Not that night. Instead, he kept his distance, trailing far enough behind that his presence wouldn't tip the man off. He simply watched, observing the careful, uneven steps, the way the man occasionally pressed a hand to his lower back, as though trying to soothe some hidden pain. By the time Marcus reached the faint glow of the industrial district, Jake had already begun forming theories. Perhaps the man worked at one of the warehouses. Perhaps he lived nowhere near here and was forced into this grueling commute. But the distance was so far, so astonishingly far, that none of it made sense. The following nights confirmed his suspicions. The man, now a familiar silhouette, appeared without fail, always at the same hour, always walking with the same weary determination. Jake began to time his route deliberately, adjusting his patrol so he could pass by that stretch of highway in hopes of catching another glimpse. At first it was curiosity, then concern, then something that resembled responsibility. Law enforcement wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about safeguarding the vulnerable, and this man seemed like someone who, for whatever reason, had fallen through the cracks. Meanwhile, for Marcus, the strain had begun to invade every part of his life. At the warehouse, he moved with the silent efficiency of someone pushing his body far beyond what it was designed to endure. His co-workers saw him as a quiet, stoic man who arrived early and left late, someone who kept to himself and never caused problems. What they didn't see were the tremors that shook his hands when no one was looking, or the way he sometimes leaned against a stack of boxes just to keep himself upright. When he returned home each night, often long after the world had turned dark again, he checked on his mother, reassured her with soft words, and collapsed into sleep without dreams. One morning, as dawn began spreading across the sky in thin streaks of pale gold, Marcus reached the warehouse with a level of exhaustion he had never felt before. His vision blurred as he approached the entrance, and for a terrifying moment, the ground tilted beneath him. He steadied himself against the side of the building, breathing through the dizziness. He couldn't be late. He couldn't afford to miss even a minute. His job was the fragile thread holding their survival together. The warehouse loomed in front of him, and he forced his legs to move until he crossed the threshold and stepped into the fluorescent-lit interior. Everything around him felt distant, muffled by the fog of fatigue. The crates he lifted that morning may as well have been stone, and each time he set one down, he felt another crack in his resolve. It was on that same morning that Jake drove by the warehouse after finishing his shift. Something about the previous night had gnawed at him. The limp he had seen, the way the man's posture had faltered in the rain. Curiosity drew him forward like a magnet. He didn't know which warehouse the man worked in, but when he saw a handful of workers clustering near a break area, he pulled over and approached, asking casual questions. At first, the workers were wary, accustomed to keeping their heads down, but when Jake described Marcus, the backpack, the quiet demeanor, the exhaustion, they nodded. They knew him. A quiet guy, always tired, always on time. Lives far, someone muttered, real far. The workers didn't know how far, not even close, but Jake did. He had followed the man's path enough times to realize he was walking from near the outskirts of Homewood, and that realization hit him with startling clarity. 22 miles, one way, 44 miles a day. And judging by the man's condition, he had been doing it not for days, but for weeks. Jake stood there for a long moment, trying to reconcile the impossible truth with the image of a man he had assumed was suspicious. The warehouse manager confirmed the rest. The man's name was Marcus. He lived alone with his mother. He never missed a shift, never complained, never caused any disruptions. But the manager didn't know about the walking. No one did. Marcus had kept his burden silent, accepting his suffering as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Jake returned to his cruiser with a storm brewing inside him. Frustration, admiration, guilt. How close he had come to stopping the man, questioning him, treating him like a potential threat. And all along, Marcus had been fighting a battle so immense, so unimaginable, that Jake felt ashamed for ever doubting him. He had spent years seeing the worst of people, witnessing the lowest corners of humanity. But this was something else entirely. A man so determined, so driven by necessity and love, that he willingly walked impossible distances just to keep his family alive. That night, Jake sat in his patrol car longer than usual before beginning his shift. Outside, the heavy stillness returned, the darkness pressing against the windows. But he no longer looked at the night the same way. Somewhere out there, Marcus had already begun his journey, already stepped back into that lonely world of dim roads and quiet suffering, already pushed his body into another cycle of relentless endurance. Jake felt a responsibility unfurl inside him, a sense that he couldn't simply watch anymore. But he also knew he needed to understand the full truth before acting. He needed to see Marcus's struggle not as a passing glimpse, but as a living reality. To witness the extent of his burden. To see what kind of man walked through storms and darkness, night after night, for reasons powerful enough to reshape his entire existence. When he pulled out of the station and drove toward the route he had come to know so well, he felt a strange sense of purpose settle into him. Tonight would be different. Tonight he would follow Marcus from the beginning of the journey. The darkness stretched before him, silent and heavy, but somewhere ahead a lone figure walked through it. And for the first time since this strange story began, Marcus was not entirely alone. Jake Harris had spent enough years patrolling the quiet edges of the county to know when something didn't add up. But nothing in his career, no late-night calls, no frantic traffic stops, no domestic disputes or petty crimes, had ever unsettled him the way the silent figure on the highway did. Every night, for more than a week, he found himself drifting toward the same stretch of road as if pulled by an invisible tether. And every night, between 2 and 4 in the morning, he saw Marcus there, walking with the same weary posture, the same limp, the same unbroken determination etched into every step. The road had become a kind of stage where one man's private suffering played out, unnoticed by the world, unnoticed by everyone except the patrol car that followed at a distance. But tonight, Jake was not content to simply observe. The questions swirling in his mind were no longer abstract curiosities. They were urgent, human, and weighted with responsibility. How long had Marcus been doing this? Why didn't he have transportation? Why was he forcing his body through such impossible rhythms? What desperation could drive a man to walk 22 miles before a grueling shift, then walk the same distance home through the darkness? Jake couldn't shake the image of Marcus limping in the rain, soaked to the bone, teeth clenched through pain that would have broken most people. Something inside him refused to let that image fade into the background noise of his memory. When he arrived at the familiar stretch of highway that night, he turned off the radio and let the hum of the cruiser settle into a low, steady rumble. The sky was moonless, a thick blanket of clouds smothering any hope of starlight. The darkness felt different, deeper than other nights, as though the world itself was holding its breath. He slowed the cruiser to a crawl, scanning the edge of the road until he saw a distant shape, small at first, then more defined as he approached. There he was. Marcus, walking with the same quiet endurance, his silhouette bent slightly forward as though pushed by an unseen force. Jake didn't stop him. Not yet. Instead, he pulled into the far lane and kept his lights dimmed. He wanted to see how Marcus moved when he thought he was alone. He wanted to understand the full reality of the man's journey, not just a snapshot. He trailed behind at a respectful distance, watching how Marcus's pace wavered on inclines, how often he paused to steady himself, how he occasionally pressed a hand against his ribs as if battling a sharp, internal pain. What struck Jake most was the absence of hesitation. There was no moment, none at all, when Marcus looked as though he might turn back. Every fiber of the man's body seemed committed to forward motion, to reaching the warehouse no matter the cost. Jake felt a strange mixture of awe and sorrow bloom inside him. This was not the behavior of someone seeking trouble. This was the behavior of someone trying to outrun it. The hours crawled by. At times, Marcus walked as if moving through water, each step slow and heavy. Other times, when the road smoothed or the shoulder widened, he seemed to gather strength, lifting his chin as though drawing courage from some unseen source. But the exhaustion was unmistakable. His shoulders drooped, his breathing visible in the cold night air, the sounds uneven. Twice he stumbled, catching himself with one hand pressed to his knee before continuing on. Jake felt every one of those stumbles as if they were his own. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting the impulse to pull over and intervene. But something in him insisted on waiting. He needed the full story, not just an interruption. He needed to understand the depth of this man's burden before deciding how to help. Eventually, the dark line of the industrial district appeared on the horizon, faint but undeniable. The warehouse lights glowed like distant beacons. Marcus's pace quickened, driven by the knowledge that his destination was finally near. Jake parked a short distance away and watched as Marcus limped toward the employee entrance, his stride uneven but determined. When Marcus finally disappeared inside the building, Jake let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The sight had shaken him more than he expected. No man should have to endure what he had just witnessed. No man should have to fight his way to a job with such monumental effort, only to face hours of physical labor afterward. Jake stepped out of the cruiser, letting the cold, early morning air clear his thoughts. He found himself pacing across the parking lot, unable to sit still. The questions that had haunted him deepened into something more urgent, more personal. He needed answers. Inside the warehouse, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Workers moved about with their usual morning lethargy, some clutching coffee mugs, others yawning as they prepared for the long day. Jake entered and approached the front desk, where a woman with tired eyes glanced up at him. He introduced himself, explained that he had been on patrol, and asked carefully crafted questions about a particular employee. Quiet man, backpack, always early. The woman's face brightened with recognition. "That's Marcus," she said. "Good worker. Never late. Hard working, that one. You'd think he sleeps here with how early he shows up." Jake hesitated, then asked the question that weighed on him more than all the others. "Do you know how he gets here?" She blinked, confused. "Drives, I guess, or buses. I never asked." He nodded politely and thanked her, but the answer didn't sit right. So he wandered deeper into the warehouse, approaching workers during their breaks. Most shrugged or shook their heads when he asked. One man frowned thoughtfully before speaking. "He doesn't drive," the man said. "At least I've never seen him in a car. Always comes in looking like he's been running a marathon or something. Figured he lived nearby." The final conversation came from the manager, a gruff man with thick eyebrows and a no-nonsense demeanor. He confirmed Marcus's reliability, his consistency, his quietness. But when Jake asked whether Marcus had ever mentioned where he lived or how he commuted, the manager simply shook his head. "He doesn't talk much about personal stuff. He just works, harder than most. You know how rare that is." Jake excused himself and stepped outside again. The gray light of early morning washed over the parking lot, revealing a world that seemed so normal compared to the strange truth he had uncovered. Marcus wasn't running from anything criminal. He wasn't engaging in suspicious behavior. He was simply doing what he had to do to survive. And somehow that made his nightly journey feel even more unbearable. Jake leaned against his cruiser and closed his eyes. He pictured Marcus's weary expression in the storm, the way he had trudged forward without looking up, the way the rain had soaked him through to the bone. He thought of the limp, the hunch in his shoulders, the dark circles beneath his eyes. He imagined the pain in each blistered step, the hunger, the cold, the relentless pressure of responsibility weighing on him. And he realized something profound. Marcus wasn't just enduring hardship, he was enduring it alone. That realization shifted something in Jake. In his years as an officer, he had responded to countless emergencies, de-escalated violent situations, and comforted frightened victims. But this was different. Marcus didn't need a rescue from danger. He needed a rescue from circumstance, from silence, from invisibility, from a world that had overlooked him entirely. Jake drove home after his shift that morning, but sleep never came. He lay awake replaying every moment he had observed on the highway, every stumble, every sign of exhaustion. He thought about the distance. 22 miles one way, 44 miles every day, and each time he pictured the number, his chest tightened. He thought about Marcus's mother, though he knew nothing of her yet. He thought about the quiet dignity Marcus carried, the lack of complaint, the absence of self-pity. Determination, he thought. That was what he'd seen. And no one should bear that alone. By the time the sun rose high enough to cast light across his living room floor, Jake had made a decision. He couldn't remain a silent observer any longer. Marcus's story needed to be known, not to shame him or expose him, but to help him. To make sure that the burden he carried was shared by more than just the worn-out soles of his sneakers. But stories don't spread on their own. They needed voices, witnesses, people willing to speak, people willing to act. Jake returned to work that evening with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. When he started his shift, he told his closest colleague about the man on the highway. The other officer listened with raised brows, disbelief slowly shifting into concern as Jake outlined everything he had seen. Word spread among the officers as the night progressed, not in the sensational tones of scandal or trouble, but with a tone of quiet respect that deepened with every retelling. Soon, Jake found that the story didn't stay contained within the station walls for long. A dispatcher repeated it to her sister, who worked at a local cafe. A warehouse worker who had overheard the earlier conversation shared it with his wife during dinner. And though Marcus had no idea, the first threads of a much larger transformation were beginning to weave themselves around him. Jake didn't know what the future held, not exactly. But he knew one thing with certainty. The next chapter of Marcus's story would not be written in darkness. Not if he could help it. Jake Harris had not meant for the story to leave the walls of the precinct. He hadn't set out to create a wave of sympathy or spark a community-wide response. All he wanted was to understand, to bear witness, and maybe, if fate allowed, to help a man who had been carrying a burden far too heavy for one pair of shoulders. But stories like Marcus's don't stay hidden when even one person speaks them with sincerity. They move like sparks in dry grass, catching, spreading, growing into something larger than anyone could have predicted. And Jake, whether he intended to or not, had become the first spark. The officers who heard about Marcus couldn't shake the story. It followed them home, into their kitchens and living rooms, where spouses and siblings listened with widening eyes. The disbelief was always the same at first, 22 miles each way, 44 miles a day on foot. But disbelief soon gave way to a deeper emotion, something like awe and sadness intertwined. People repeated the story because it didn't feel like something that could belong to one man alone. It felt like a truth that reflected something much greater about struggle, perseverance, and how invisible hardship could be. Before long, Jake found himself approached by people outside the station who had somehow heard fragments of the story. Some asked if the man was homeless. Others asked if he was in danger. A few worried that he might be the victim of some unspoken abuse or coercion. Jake corrected these assumptions as best he could, though he was still careful not to give away Marcus's name or address. It wasn't about exposing him. It was about trying to gather enough understanding and support to do the right thing. But as more questions surfaced, Jake realized that the story had taken on a life of its own. It was already drifting through the town in half-formed whispers, each retelling adding emotion and urgency. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his impossible routine, unaware that he had become the subject of quiet conversations and growing concern. His world remained painfully small: the dark road, the warehouse, the long walk home. His feet were in worse condition than ever, swollen and blistered with patches of torn skin that burned each time he stepped forward. He no longer felt truly awake during the day. Everything seemed muted and dreamlike, as though he were trapped behind a thin layer of fog. Hunger clouded his thoughts, and even the smallest tasks required a monumental effort. Yet, he pushed through each shift because he had no choice. His mother depended on him, and the fear of failing her was more powerful than the pain tearing through his body. At home, she noticed his decline with growing alarm. He could no longer hide the way he winced when he bent down or the way he limped from room to room. She tried to ask him what was wrong, but he always brushed her off with a soft smile and a tired voice, insisting that work was simply demanding. She knew better. A mother always knows, even if she doesn't understand the details. She watched him leave earlier each night and return later each day, his clothes drenched in sweat even on cold mornings, and she prayed silently for his strength to hold just a little longer. As the story spread, Jake began receiving messages from people who wanted to help. A local church wondered if they could offer food or clothing. A mechanic asked whether Marcus might need car repairs. He would waive the labor cost. A small business owner asked if the man needed a temporary place to stay closer to work. Jake realized that the community's heart was larger than he had given it credit for. People weren't just curious, they were moved. They wanted to lift some portion of the burden they had heard about, even if only a little. But the real turning point came when a warehouse worker, one of Marcus's co-workers, mentioned the story to his wife, who happened to be active in a local online group. She posted about it, carefully, without names, describing the man who walked 22 miles every night to get to a job he could not afford to lose. She wrote about his determination, his exhaustion, and the courage it took to keep going when most people would have surrendered. The post was written with such raw sincerity that it struck a nerve. Within hours, it garnered hundreds of reactions. Within a day, thousands. People commented from neighboring towns, from other states, from places miles away. They marveled at the dedication, questioned how such hardship could go unnoticed, and expressed a desire to help in whatever way they could. The post spread from one platform to another through shares and reposts, each time with new commentary. Some expressed gratitude for the reminder of human resilience. Others expressed anger that someone had been forced into such an extreme situation. Some simply asked how to help. And through it all, a sense of collective responsibility began to take shape. This wasn't just one man's story anymore. It was becoming a symbol, a reflection of the strength hidden in ordinary people and the ways society often overlooked them. When the story reached a popular local blog, it exploded. The blog writer expanded on the details, framing Marcus's walk as an act of noble perseverance, a testament to what some people quietly endure without complaint. She ended her piece with a simple call to action. This man deserves better. Let's help him. The comments poured in faster than anyone anticipated. Offers to donate money, offers to donate shoes, offers to organize transportation. One person asked whether a GoFundMe campaign existed. Another replied that she would gladly start one. Within an hour, the fundraiser was live, and within 3 hours, the initial goal of buying a used car had been surpassed. Donations came from strangers who said the story had touched them, from people who had once faced similar struggles, from retired veterans, single parents, business owners, and college students alike. Each donation carried a message of encouragement, a reminder that Marcus was not invisible, that the world had seen him now. Jake watched the campaign with a mix of wonder and disbelief. He had never imagined the story would resonate so deeply. He had never imagined people would respond with such unrestrained generosity. And yet, as he watched the numbers rise, he felt a heavy responsibility pressing down on him. He couldn't keep Marcus's identity hidden much longer. At some point, Marcus needed to be told what was happening. He needed to be shown that he was no longer walking alone, but approaching the man wouldn't be easy. Marcus had built his life around silence, around carrying burdens quietly. Would he accept help? Would he believe he deserved it? Jake didn't know, but he knew that he had to try. That night, when the hour drew close to Marcus's usual departure time, Jake parked his cruiser at a spot he had come to recognize as the first mile marker of the long, lonely journey. He waited, hands clasped, heart steady but tense. The darkness hung thick around him, the only sound the hum of the engine and the distant drone of insects. And then, at last, he saw the silhouette appear at the end of the street. The familiar slow steps, the bowed head, the thin outline of the backpack. Jake let him walk closer before stepping out of the cruiser. The night air was cold against his skin, and his breath fogged slightly as he exhaled. He approached Marcus slowly, not wanting to startle him. Marcus stopped when he recognized the shape of the officer, his posture stiffening as though bracing for trouble. But instead of questioning him, instead of treating him like a suspect, Jake simply stood there, meeting his eyes with quiet sincerity. "Marcus," he said softly, "there's something you need to know." The words hung between them like a fragile bridge. In the minutes that followed, as the dim glow of the street light flickered above them, the truth began to unfold. Jake told him what he had seen, what he had learned, what the community now knew. He told him about the people who wanted to help, about the fundraiser, about the thousands of strangers who had been moved by his relentless determination. Marcus listened in stunned silence, his breath catching, his shoulders trembling not from fatigue, but from disbelief. No one had ever seen him before, not like this. No one had ever cared enough to notice. The kindness he had been met with was almost impossible to process. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of weeks, months, years, pressing down on him all at once. For the first time since his world had begun collapsing, he felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Something that felt like hope. The days that followed were a blur of transformation. The fundraiser surpassed every expectation, allowing not only for the purchase of a reliable vehicle, but enough to cover his mother's medications, overdue bills, and basic repairs to the house. Local volunteers offered to deliver meals. A mechanic volunteered to perform maintenance on the donated car free of charge. A church group brought groceries. One business owner offered to help Marcus pursue further training if he ever wanted a promotion or a new career path. But what moved Marcus most was not the money or the offers. It was the handwritten notes from strangers, notes that said things like, "Your strength inspires me. You reminded me not to give up. Thank you for showing the world what determination looks like." Messages from people who had never met him, yet felt connected to his struggle as though it were their own. He found himself reading those notes over and over, the words filling spaces inside him that had long been hollow. His mother cried softly when she learned what the community had done, her hands shaking as she held the printed messages, unable to articulate the gratitude she felt. Marcus's life changed. His days no longer began in the suffocating darkness of a midnight walk. His feet, given time to heal, slowly lost the sores and tremors that had plagued them. His face, still tired but no longer gaunt, softened with relief when he realized he would never have to choose between work and survival again. The house grew a little brighter as bills were paid and worries eased. His mother, with access to proper medication, regained a warmth in her cheeks that had been missing for far too long. And through it all, Marcus remained who he had always been: humble, quiet, steady. When reporters eventually caught wind of the story and asked him how he felt, he simply shrugged and said, "I just walked." But the world had seen far more than that. It had seen a man who refused to break, even when life gave him every reason to fall. It had seen the power of kindness and collective compassion. It had seen how one person's struggle could awaken something better in everyone around him. A new phrase began to circulate online in comments, on signs held by volunteers, in hashtags shared across the country: "Be like Marcus." And though he never asked for it, though he never sought recognition, Marcus became a symbol of endurance, humility, and quiet strength, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could rise, step by painful step, toward the light. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Share this one with someone who needs to see it, and keep watching our other stories right after this. Your support helps us keep going.